My best friend called me jealous for skipping her $9,000 birthday to sit by my dying granddad, then showed up at his celebration screaming about revenge. When I told her there's a baby at risk, she rolled her eyes and said, "Now you're making my birthday about you?" I just walked away. That was 2 years ago. Yesterday, she left a $50,000 check on my porch without saying a word. I was sitting in the ICU painting my granddad's nails when the nurses told me he only had days left to live. My parents died when I was 8, and he was the only family I had. That's when I felt a vibration on my inner thigh. It was a call from my best friend Bianca. "Hey, so what are you wearing to my birthday tomorrow night?" "Oh, I don't think I'll be able to come," I responded. I felt like a terrible friend for canceling so last minute, but I had no choice. "Are you freaking serious right now? What will everyone think when my best friend isn't at my party? You have to come." "Bianca, my granddad's dying. I've kept it private, but—" "Oh my gosh," she interrupted. "Now you're making my birthday about you? My parents literally spent $9,000 on party supplies alone. Just admit you're jealous that you're broke, and I'm turning 21 first." Luckily, I had AirPods in so my granddad couldn't hear her BS, and I hung up. She started spamming me with texts that were even worse than her call, but I felt like a petty hoe that day. So I made a group chat of our entire friend group without her and sent every screenshot. Mia called immediately. "Babe, I'm so sorry about your granddad. Also, Bianca's canceled. But listen, I have an idea that's downright evil." Within an hour, my granddad's hospice waiting room was filled with young girls determined to cheer him up. "Girl," Mia announced, "F Bianca's birthday party. I want your granddad to be happy." My eyes welled up with tears as I realized every other girl in our friend group felt the same way. I wasn't even mad at Bianca for leaking my secret. That's when Tori jumped in. "My mom owns that catering company. She'll donate everything for your granddad's final party. I'll make a Facebook event," said Sienna. "Private at first, then public an hour before." "Wait," said Jess, showing her phone. "Bianca's already posting about her exclusive VIP list. She's bragging about how selective she's being." "Perfect. Let's be even more exclusive. Celebrating Harold's beautiful life final gathering." The planning was intricate. We created shifts so granddad wouldn't be overwhelmed. "I'll coordinate transportation for all his elderly friends." Ashley volunteered. "My boyfriend's in a jazz quartet. They'll play for free," added Tori. The group chat was fire. Everyone Bianca had invited was asking subtle questions. Not about her, but about my granddad. "Hey, did you hear about OP's granddad? Is it true he raised her alone? Was he really a war hero?" The answer to all their questions was yes. BTW LOL. By Thursday, Bianca was panicking in her stories. "Reminder, my party requires RSVP, exclusive guest list only." But people were already choosing. Her own cousin messaged me. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your grandfather sounds like an amazing person. I'll be there." Friday night, Mia texted, "Check Bianca's story. She'd posted a poll. Who's coming tomorrow?" Only 12% said yes, LOL. Then she posted, "Quality over quantity. Intimate vibes only." We didn't respond. We were too busy setting up a hospice common room with hundreds of battery-powered candles, memory boards spanning 8 decades, and flowers from his own garden. Saturday morning came too fast. I woke up in the chair beside Granddad's bed, my hand still holding his. He was awake, just watching me with those kind eyes that had watched me grow up. "Big day, pumpkin," he whispered. I couldn't speak, just nodded, tears already forming. The nurses helped me get him ready. His best cardigan, the one Grandma knitted him 40 years ago. His hands shook as I helped him with the buttons. "I might not see everyone," he started, then stopped. We both knew what he meant. He might not see everyone again. "You will," I lied, fixing his collar. "You're the strongest person I know." By 7 p.m., the common room was transformed. The fairy lights made everything glow soft and golden. The jazz quartet was warming up quietly. Almost everyone who was invited to Bianca's party had chosen my granddad's gathering over hers. His war buddy wheeled in first. They just looked at each other and started crying. Then came his first student from 1967, now a grandmother herself. Each person who walked in made Granddad's eyes water more. "All this fuss for me?" he kept saying, but his voice was thick with emotion. "You deserve everything," I whispered. At 8:47 p.m., my phone exploded. It was Bianca. "Where is everyone?" Even my cousin ditched. Then, "I know you did something." At 9:23 p.m., the doors burst open. Bianca stood there in her birthday tiara and designer dress, mascara streaking. The jazz stopped. Everyone turned. "How dare you?" she started. "Bianca," someone's grandmother said firmly, "this is a celebration of life. Please be respectful." She saw the photos, the war medals, the teaching awards, the 100 people who'd chosen love over her party. "This is, you ruined." My granddad, sweet as ever, patted the chair beside him. "You must be Bianca. I saved you some cake." She looked at him, at me, at everyone staring at her with disappointment. Then she ran. "Just you freaking wait and see when I get my revenge." At the time, I just rolled my eyes, blissfully unaware of the secrets that rich bitches like her were hiding. The morning after Granddad's celebration, my phone buzzed so hard it fell off the nightstand. I grabbed it and saw 47 missed calls from Bianca, plus a voicemail that made my stomach drop. Her voice was ice cold, saying my mom was already calling the hospice board about our unauthorized gathering, and that Granddad would enjoy his last days with new restrictions. My hands shook as I watched the hospice director walking straight toward Granddad's room carrying a stack of official-looking paperwork. She knocked and entered while I scrambled to follow her inside. The director looked at the complaint form, then at Granddad sleeping peacefully, and did something I didn't expect. She tore the papers in half and dropped them in the trash. She told me Granddad taught her daughter 30 years ago, and some complaints weren't worth the paper they were written on, but she warned me the Whitmores donated heavily to the hospital foundation, and I needed to be careful because they had real influence here. I spent the next 3 days barely leaving Granddad's side, holding his hand while reading him stories his former students had sent. His grip got weaker each day until I could barely feel it anymore. Mia brought me coffee every morning and just sat there quietly because we both knew there was nothing to say that would help. Thursday morning, I checked my phone and saw Bianca had posted on Instagram about people using dying relatives for attention and calling it pathetic. Within 10 minutes, our entire friend group had unfollowed her, and the screenshots were already spreading everywhere. She deleted it fast, but her own cousin messaged me saying Bianca was getting worse and I should be careful. Day 5 at the hospice, Granddad could barely open his eyes, but he grabbed my hand and whispered something about Bianca and her family being broken. He said he saw it at parent conferences years ago, but I didn't understand what he meant. I recorded it on my phone because these were his last coherent words about anything beyond our family. The hospice billing office called that afternoon saying someone tried to cancel Granddad's insurance authorization. They traced the call to a number registered to Whitmore Pharmaceuticals, which was Bianca's mother's company. The billing clerk sounded really uncomfortable, admitting this wasn't the first time they'd had issues with that family. Granddad's breathing changed that night, and the nurses explained about something called Cheney-Stokes breathing that meant his body was shutting down. I counted the seconds between each breath while Mia's mom brought me a blanket and homemade soup I couldn't even look at. A delivery arrived the next morning, and it was a single white rose with a card that said, "For the soon-to-be orphan," signed with just a B. The security guard saw my face and quietly pocketed the card, saying he'd keep it if I needed it later, because that was crossing a line. Granddad's former colleague showed up with a box of of his things from the school that had been in storage for years. Inside were parent conference notes from 2010 to 2015, and the Whitmore file was thicker than any other family's. The notes mentioned inappropriate pressure on other families and concerns about Victoria's pharmaceutical connections going back years. Day 8 at the hospice, I couldn't sleep and kept waking up every time Granddad's breathing changed or stopped. The overnight nurse brought me tea at 3 a.m. and mentioned she'd worked at 3 other facilities where the Whitmores had caused problems for families they didn't like. Around 5 that morning, Granddad's breathing got really weird and choppy. I grabbed his hand and his eyes suddenly opened, clearer than they'd been in weeks. He looked right at me and squeezed my hand tight. His voice came out rough but strong when he said the house had papers in the basement behind the water heater and I needed to be careful. He told me he loved me and squeezed my hand 3 times, which was our special code since I was 8 years old. I squeezed back 3 times and watched his face relax into a small smile. The machine started beeping different at 6:47 a.m. and I felt his hand go slack in mine. His chest stopped moving and the last little pulse in his wrist just faded away under my fingers. The nurse came in and checked him with her stethoscope and wrote down 6:52 on her clipboard. While they were pulling the sheet up over his face, I saw movement in the hallway. Bianca was standing there with her mother Victoria, who was wearing a business suit at 7 in the morning. Victoria looked right at me and smiled this cold little smile before they walked away down the corridor. 3 days later, while I was trying to pick out flowers, the funeral home director called me. How did the nurses know exactly when to tear up those papers? Did they already know something bad about Bianca's family? The way Granddad squeezed her hand 3 times makes me wonder if that was their secret code for years and years. Someone had called them claiming Granddad owed the Whitmores money, and they were contesting the funeral payment. The director said he'd known Granddad for 30 years and would handle everything anyway, but this was legally weird. I drove to Granddad's house for the first time since he died and just sat in the driveway for 10 minutes. Walking in hit me hard because everything smelled like him, that mix of Old Spice and coffee that meant home. His favorite cardigan was still draped over his chair and I couldn't make myself move it. I went down to the basement and found the water heater in the corner. Behind it was a metal filing cabinet I'd never seen before with a padlock on it. I used bolt cutters from the garage and inside were 7 manila folders with names I didn't recognize. Each folder had pharmacy records from different Whitmore stores with certain medications circled in red pen. Granddad's handwriting was all over the margins with notes about dosages being increased without doctor approval. One folder showed how a generic drug got switched to brand name and the price jumped 400%. Mia came over that afternoon to help me figure out funeral stuff and saw the folders spread across the kitchen table. She picked one up and her face went white when she read the name Rosa Martinez. She told me that was her aunt who died last year and went to a Whitmore pharmacy. Her aunt's medications kept changing and she got really confused in her last months. The estate lawyer called while we were sitting there and said someone filed a claim against Granddad's estate. They wanted $47,000 for unpaid pharmaceutical consulting fees, which made no sense. The claim was signed by Victoria Whitmore personally and dated the day after Granddad died. A week after he passed, we had the funeral at the small chapel he picked out years ago. I was halfway through my eulogy when Bianca walked in wearing a white dress like she was going to a party. She sat in the back row texting, and every time I got emotional, she'd fake cough really loud. Through the window, I could see her mom's Mercedes idling in the parking lot with the engine running. After the service, Granddad's war buddy grabbed my arm and pulled me aside near the coat room. He told me Harold had been investigating something before he got sick, and if anything happened, I should find Billy Stewart at the hospital. He said Billy was a social worker who'd been documenting things for months. I met Billy at a coffee shop downtown 3 days later, and he kept looking over his shoulder the whole time. He was sweating even though it was cold, and his hands shook when he picked up his cup. He told me Granddad had contacted him 6 months ago about elderly patients at Whitmore pharmacies. They'd been tracking 7 deaths where medications got changed without doctor approval, and every single estate got drained by medical debt afterward. Billy kept checking his phone and said he had to go, but gave me a folder with copies of everything he'd found and told me to be careful because these people had connections everywhere. 3 days later, I was at the grocery store getting milk and bread when Victoria appeared right behind me at the pharmacy counter where I was picking up my birth control. She grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and pulled me close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with wine, even though it was only noon. Her voice was low and mean when she said my grandfather was a meddling old fool, and I was following in his footsteps, and if I didn't drop this whole thing, I'd lose more than just a house. The pharmacist behind the counter watched the whole thing with wide eyes, and after Victoria stormed off, she slipped me a folded piece of paper when she handed me my prescription bag. I didn't read it until I got to my car, and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely unfold it, but it said she'd been forced to change prescriptions for elderly customers, and she had records if I needed them. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee, and it was the estate lawyer sounding really stressed. He said Victoria had filed paperwork for power of attorney over Granddad's entire estate and was claiming I was mentally unstable due to grief and couldn't handle the responsibility. The hearing was in 3 days, and even though he said it was completely baseless, I had to show up, or I'd risk a default judgment that would give her control of everything Granddad left me. I spent the rest of that day at Granddad's house going through more of his papers and trying not to cry when I saw his handwriting on everything. The garden out back was getting overgrown, and his tomato plants were dying, so I grabbed the watering can and spent an hour trying to save them. His gardening journal was sitting on the potting bench, and I flipped through it while the plants soaked up the water. Between notes about when to plant beans and how much fertilizer to use for the roses, there were other notes written in pencil that made my stomach drop. One from 2 months ago said VW visited again today, and another said threatened nursing home if I don't cooperate, and the worst one just said must protect others from her. That night, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I got a text from an unknown number that just said, "This is Linda Whitmore, and I need to talk to you about my mom." My heart started racing because Linda was Bianca's younger sister who was only 19 and still lived at home. She said her mom didn't know she was contacting me, and she'd found something in her home office about my grandfather and other elderly people that I needed to see. She asked if we could meet at the college library the next day and promised she'd explain everything. I barely slept that night and showed up at the library 15 minutes early with my hands sweating and my heart pounding. Linda was already there in a back corner study room looking scared and kept checking over her shoulder like someone might be following her. She pulled out a flash drive with shaking hands and pushed it across the table to me. Her voice was barely a whisper when she told me there were emails on it about her mom targeting elderly customers who owned property, and she'd been marking them as phase 1 through phase 3 based on their health status. My grandfather had been marked phase 3, which meant terminal, and there were 6 other names on the same list. She looked like she might throw up when she said Bianca didn't know how deep this went, and her mom had been doing this for years. 2 days later, I had to go to the competency hearing, and Victoria showed up with 3 people I'd never seen before who all claimed they'd witnessed me acting erratically since Granddad's death. One woman said she'd seen me talking to myself at the grocery store, and a man claimed I'd been screaming at people in the parking lot of Granddad's nursing home, which was complete BS because I hadn't even been there since he died. The judge looked suspicious and kept asking them for specific dates and times which they couldn't provide, but he still scheduled a full hearing in 2 weeks to investigate further. Detective Ray was sitting in the back row taking notes the whole time and caught my eye when Victoria's witnesses stumbled over their stories. That night, I plugged in the flash drive Linda gave me and spent hours going through spreadsheets titled Estate Acquisition Project that made me want to throw up. There were 7 names that matched the folders in Granddad's filing cabinet with columns showing their home values and something called Medication Adjustment Schedule that showed when each person's prescriptions got changed. Every single person who died had their medications switched 6 to 8 months before their death, and the changes created side effects that required expensive treatments that drained their savings. The next evening, Mia invited me over for dinner with her family, and her grandmother pulled me aside after we ate. She held my hands tight and told me Granddad had been so proud of me, and he knew something was wrong but wanted to protect me from it. Then she went to her bedroom and came back with Granddad's old lesson plan book that he'd lent her years ago for her tutoring business. Inside the front cover were more notes in his handwriting about Victoria visiting elderly customers and pressuring them to change their insurance plans and medications. 3 days after that, I came home from spending the afternoon at Granddad's house organizing his things and knew immediately something was wrong because my door was slightly open, even though I always double-check the lock. Nothing was stolen, but every single photo of Granddad in my apartment was turned face down, and there was an empty pharmacy pill bottle sitting on my pillow with my name on it for a medication I'd never heard of. The prescription date on the label was tomorrow, which made no sense, and the prescribing doctor's name was someone I'd never been to. I called Ray immediately, and he came over with 2 other officers to dust for fingerprints and take photos of everything. He officially opened an investigation that night, but warned me the Whitmores had connections throughout the city, and they'd know within hours that police were looking into them. He assigned a patrol car to drive by my apartment twice a day and told me to call immediately if anything else happened. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop with texts from people I hadn't talked to in years. Billy had done it. The local news was running a story about elderly deaths connected to Whitmore pharmacy customers, and my phone screen showed 14 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I turned on the TV, and there was Victoria in her perfect suit denying everything, but her hands were shaking and she kept touching her pearl necklace the way people do when they're lying. My phone rang again, and it was another family whose grandmother died after switching to Whitmore pharmacies 6 months ago. Why did Victoria pick that exact moment in the grocery store to threaten her? Was she following her around, or does she have people watching? Then another call about someone's dad who went from healthy to dead in 3 weeks after they changed his heart medication. I started writing down all their names and stories in Granddad's old notebook while watching Victoria stumble through her interview. 3 days later, Linda texted me to meet her at the park near the old elementary school, and when I got there, she was sitting with some guy in a hoodie who kept looking around nervously. He worked IT at Whitmore Corporate and had been copying their servers for weeks because he couldn't stand what they were doing anymore. He showed me printouts of an actual algorithm on his laptop that selected targets based on age, property ownership, and how many family members they had. The fewer relatives, the higher the score. My granddad had figured it out months ago, according to the timestamps on his research. That afternoon, I went back to Granddad's house to pack more of his things and found his Bible on the nightstand with a bookmark sticking out. Inside was a letter dated exactly 1 week before he died, and my hands shook as I read his careful handwriting telling me not to let anger eat me up, to use the law and the community and the truth because they prey on people who are alone. I was crying so hard I almost didn't notice the house was freezing cold until I tried to turn on the heat and nothing happened. The power was off and so was the water. When I called the utility company, they said there was a $15,000 balance from commercial medical equipment charges, which made no sense because Granddad always paid his bills 2 weeks early and never had any commercial equipment. Ray called while I was still arguing with the utility company, and his voice was different, serious in a way that made my stomach drop. They'd found records of a journalist named David Park who investigated Victoria 3 years ago and died in a car accident 2 weeks after confronting her about the pharmacy deaths. His editor still had all his notes and wanted to meet with us. 3 days later at the town hall meeting about healthcare costs, I watched Maria Martinez stand up in the middle of Victoria's presentation about affordable medicine and start shouting about how Whitmore killed her mother with fake prescriptions. Then another person stood up, then another, and suddenly the whole room was chaos with families yelling about their dead relatives, while security guards rushed Victoria out the back door. That night, the pharmacist who'd slipped me the note months ago called from a blocked number and said she'd been documenting forced prescription changes for 2 years and had recordings of Victoria threatening to destroy any pharmacist who didn't comply with the new protocols. She had 12 other pharmacists ready to testify if I could guarantee their protection somehow. I spent the next day at Granddad's house packing his bedroom and trying not to cry at every little thing, like his reading glasses still sitting on his book or his slippers perfectly lined up by the bed. In his wallet, I found a photo of me at 8 years old, the day he became my guardian after my parents died, and behind it was a business card for an FBI agent with a note in Granddad's writing that said to call this number if something happened to him. My hands were shaking as I dialed and left a voicemail. 4 days later, Bianca cornered me at the coffee shop downtown, her face red and her designer bag clutched so tight her knuckles were white. She kept saying I was destroying her family and her mom was just a businesswoman, but when I showed her the folder with all the evidence about the deaths, her voice got smaller and smaller until she was whispering that her mom would never do something like that, even though I could see in her eyes she was starting to believe it. The FBI agent called back that afternoon, and Agent Sarah Kim said Granddad had contacted her 6 months ago, but didn't have enough evidence for them to act on it then. But with everything we had now, plus the interstate commerce angle, she could open a federal investigation into medical fraud and possibly murder. My phone rang at 2 in the morning, and Linda was crying so hard I could barely understand her words. She kept saying her mom found out about us talking and was sending her to Switzerland on the first flight tomorrow. She'd left a box of documents with campus security that had everything from her mom's personal files. She said she was sorry about my grandfather and that he was trying to save people before the line went dead. I threw on clothes and drove to campus in the dark while calling Mia to meet me there. The security guard knew me from all my late study nights and handed over the cardboard box without questions. My hands shook as I opened it in the parking lot under a streetlight. Inside were printed emails between Victoria and someone named Dr. Morrison discussing adjusted death certificates for 7 elderly patients. One email from 6 months ago made me drop the papers. Victoria had written about Harold getting too close and needing to accelerate his timeline. I took photos of everything with my phone while Mia held the flashlight. We drove straight to Detective Ray's house even though it was 4 in the morning. He answered the door in his bathrobe and actually listened this time as we spread the papers across his kitchen table. By noon, Victoria had filed a $2 million defamation lawsuit against me. The same afternoon, my lawyer called saying the estate claim had jumped to $150,000. She said Victoria was trying to bury me in legal fees because desperate people make these kinds of moves when they're scared. I noticed the white van the next morning parked outside Mia's apartment where I'd been staying. It followed us to the grocery store, then to campus, then back home for 3 straight days. On the 3rd day, I walked right right up to the driver's window at a red light and knocked hard. The guy inside claimed he was a private investigator hired to document my mental instability for the lawsuit. Mia filmed him admitting he'd been photographing me through windows and following me everywhere. We sent the video to Agent Kim, who called Detective Ray immediately. They'd been coordinating their investigations and found Whitmore had been doing this in 3 different states. Agent Kim said they'd identified over 40 suspicious deaths that matched the same pattern. She told me this wasn't just about my grandfather anymore, but had become a serial murder investigation. Billy started a Facebook group for families who'd lost someone at Whitmore facilities. Within 2 days, we had over 100 members sharing their stories about sudden declines and mysterious medication changes. We decided to create a website called Whitmore Victims United, with all our evidence organized by date and location. The site crashed within 4 hours from too much traffic as 147 families uploaded their documents. Victoria sent cease and desist letters to everyone, but her own lawyer withdrew from representing her, citing ethical concerns. Billy and I took everything to the state attorney general's office with 3 boxes of printed evidence. She reviewed it for 2 hours while we sat in her waiting room drinking terrible coffee. When she called us back in, she said she was issuing immediate subpoenas for all Whitmore pharmaceutical records. She said if even half of what we showed her was true, this would be the largest healthcare fraud case in state history. I couldn't sleep at Granddad's house anymore because everything reminded me of him. My own apartment felt unsafe after the private investigator incident, so I stayed at Mia's place. I woke up at 3 in the morning thinking I heard Granddad calling my name from the living room. Mia found me standing in her kitchen just staring at nothing and crying. She held me while I shook and promised we were going to get justice because Granddad knew I could do this. The next morning, Bianca posted a video on Instagram wearing designer clothes in her mansion. She said her family was being persecuted by jealous losers who couldn't accept their relatives died naturally. Within an hour, Linda posted her own video from some fancy boarding school in Switzerland. She looked straight at the camera and said her mother was a murderer with proof to back it up. She apologized for everyone her family had hurt and said she'd testify if needed. 3 days later, the FBI showed up at Whitmore Pharmaceutical at 6 in the morning with a warrant. They raided Victoria's house at the exact same time with news helicopters circling overhead filming everything. Agents carried out dozens of boxes while neighbors stood on their lawns recording with their phones. Victoria got photographed in handcuffs being led to a black SUV in her silk pajamas and slippers. She posted $5 million bail and was out within 4 hours. But the damage was done. Every news channel ran the footage of her arrest on repeat while the story went viral online. My phone rang at 6 in the morning 2 days later, and Ray sounded different this time, like he couldn't believe what he was about to say. David's widow had just walked into the police station with a box of old cassette tapes her husband had secretly recorded of Victoria talking about removing obstacles, and my granddad's name was right there on one of them from 3 months before he died. The FBI agents came to my apartment within an hour and played me the recording where Victoria's voice was clear as day saying Harold was becoming a problem and asking David if there were ways to speed up natural processes without leaving traces. My hands shook so bad I dropped my coffee mug and it shattered on the floor while the agents kept writing notes about attempted murder and conspiracy charges. That same afternoon, they arrested the medical examiner who'd signed Granddad's death certificate, and he started talking before they even got him to the station, telling them about every single death certificate he'd changed for Victoria and showing them bank records of the $50,000 payments she'd made him. The IT guy with a hoodie actually had an algorithm that scored people based on how many relatives they had. That's such a strange way to pick targets. I wonder if Victoria created it herself or hired someone to make it work that way. The paperwork got changed that week from natural causes to suspicious circumstances pending investigation, and I finally had proof that Granddad didn't just die peacefully in his sleep like everyone kept telling me. 3 weeks later, on day 58, I held the memorial service Granddad deserved at the community center with over 300 people showing up, including students he'd taught 40 years ago who drove from different states just to be there. Each person stood up and told a story about how he'd help them, like a single mom he tutored for free so she could get her GED, or the kid he paid for lunch every day for 3 years without anyone knowing. The mayor showed up halfway through and declared it Herald Day in the city with an official proclamation and everything, while I stood there crying, watching all these people whose lives he changed. Bianca sat in a car across the street the whole time, just watching through the window, but never came inside and drove away when people started leaving. 2 days after that, Victoria tried to run and got caught at JFK Airport with $2 million cash stuffed in 3 suitcases and a fake passport with a name Sarah Mitchell, plus documents showing she'd been planning this escape for months. The judge was so mad about her trying to flee that he revoked her bail completely and ordered her held in federal custody until trial for murder, fraud, and racketeering charges that could put her away for life. The next week, I sat in a law office conference room while 17 different families joined a civil lawsuit against Whitmore Pharmaceuticals and watched on my phone as their stock price dropped 78% in 1 day, making the company basically worthless. The board of directors held an emergency meeting that lasted 6 hours, then fired every single executive and put out a statement saying they'd cooperate fully with all investigations and compensate victims. 4 days later, on day 62, I was packing up Granddad's house when Bianca showed up at the door, looking like she'd lost 20 pounds with dark circles under her eyes and her hands shaking when she knocked. She stood there for a minute before saying she didn't know what her mom had been doing, that she thought it was just business complaints, and then pulled out a check for $50,000 from her trust fund and left it on the porch saying it wouldn't bring him back, but maybe it could help somehow. The next week, the pharmacist whistleblowers testified to the grand jury, and one of them completely broke down crying while describing how Victoria had threatened to destroy her whole family if she didn't change an elderly man's heart medication to something that would speed things along, and that man had died 3 months later. After that testimony, I couldn't go into pharmacies anymore because the smell made me throw up, so Mia had to pick up my prescriptions while I started seeing a therapist twice a week who kept telling me it wasn't my fault, but I couldn't stop thinking about how Granddad suffered for months because I'd been friends with Bianca. Linda flew back from Switzerland on day 67 with a laptop full of recordings she'd secretly made of her mother over the years, including one from a dinner party where Victoria literally said old people were just resources being wasted and she was doing society a favor by recycling their assets. The FBI agent who listened to all the recordings told me they'd discovered Victoria's network went way beyond Connecticut into 12 different states where she'd been training other pharmacy owners in her method of slowly poisoning elderly patients while stealing their Medicare benefits. They arrested 19 more people that week, including 3 doctors and 6 pharmacists, plus an insurance executive who'd been helping cover up the suspicious death patterns. The lead FBI agent sat with me in Granddad's empty house and said my grandfather had saved potentially hundreds of lives by keeping those records, because without his evidence, they never would have uncovered this whole network of people killing old folks for money. 3 days later, the detective called while I was packing up Granddad's kitchen plates and told me they'd broken into a safe hidden behind a fake wall in Victoria's office. Inside were 43 folders with old people's photos stapled to the front, and each one had medical records and bank statements and surveillance footage photos of them going to doctor appointments. The detective's voice got real quiet when he said they found Granddad's folder with a red stamp across it that said, "Completed with obstacle removed," written underneath in Victoria's handwriting. My hands started shaking so bad I dropped the phone and just stood there in his empty kitchen crying. The next morning, some IT guy who used to work for Whitmore came forward with screenshots of this sick program Victoria made him build that would scan through pharmacy records looking for old people worth more than $500,000 with less than $100,000 in savings who only had one person to leave everything to. The program ranked them by how much money they were worth, and Granddad was number 3 on the list. Then this former pharmacy tech called the FBI saying she quit 2 years ago when Victoria asked her to research drugs that would kill old people but look natural, and she kept all the emails where Victoria specifically wanted stuff that wouldn't show up in regular drug tests. I drove to the cemetery that afternoon to tell Granddad about Victoria being denied bail for the 3rd time and how his evidence was helping hundreds of families now. While I was sitting by his headstone, this woman I'd never seen before walked up and said her dad was one of the 7 victims and that Granddad had tried to warn him about the pharmacy switching his pills, but nobody believed him. She thanked me for finishing what Granddad started, and we both just stood there crying together. The medical examiner called that night with the worst news yet because they'd figured out Victoria personally picked the exact combination of drugs that killed Granddad, and she'd been tracking his decline through the pharmacy computer system, so she knew down to the week when he would die. The news reported that Whitmore was filing for bankruptcy, and all their stores would be sold to pay the victims' families, and they were turning the main building into a senior center named after the people Victoria killed. Victoria's personal money, $47 million, got frozen by the court. At her pretrial hearing, Victoria suddenly stood up and started screaming that old people were going to die anyway, and she just helped speed it up and society should be grateful. Her lawyer tried to say she was mentally ill, but the judge said it sounded more like she was confessing to murder. Linda showed up at my door with a letter from Bianca, who was too ashamed to send it herself, where she wrote about being sorry for how she treated me and Granddad, and how her mom raised her to see people as things to use, and she never knew her mom saw them as things to kill. I spent my last day in Granddad's house before the estate sale, just walking through the rooms that still smelled like his aftershave and coffee. In his desk, I found this photo of him holding me when I was 8 with my parents standing behind us, and on the back he'd written my whole world in his shaky handwriting. I sat on his bedroom floor holding that photo and sobbing until I couldn't breathe. The prosecutor called the next morning saying they'd connected Victoria to 3 old people who died at her first pharmacy job back in the 90s, and they think she's been killing people for 25 years, and the total might be over 100 victims, so now she's looking at life in prison with no chance of getting out. Ray called the next day while I was eating cereal and said they found poison in Granddad's tissue samples they'd saved. It was some custom-made stuff that looked like heart failure, and she'd ordered it months before he died. The arraignment happened 3 weeks later, and Victoria stood there in her orange jumpsuit pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecutor hit play on his laptop, and Victoria's voice filled the courtroom talking about how Harold was almost ready, and she'd have his house to flip soon. She'd recorded herself 2 weeks before he died calling him an old fool who never saw it coming. I threw up in the courthouse bathroom after hearing that. Mia came over the next week to help me pack Granddad's stuff, and we found this old book about World War II that felt weird when I picked it up. Inside was hollowed out with $30,000 in cash, and a note in his shaky handwriting saying he knew something might happen, and this was to fight them and not let them win. He'd signed it, "All my love, Granddad," and called me pumpkin like always, and I just sat there on his bedroom floor crying because he knew he was in danger, but stayed anyway. The FBI agent showed up at my door 2 days later with a folder thick as a phone book, showing Victoria's offshore accounts with $73 million stolen from old people over 20 years. They found this list on her computer called Future Acquisitions, with 200 names of elderly people with property, and every single one got a warning call that day. Bianca took a stand on day 90 of the investigation, and told everyone how her mom trained her since she was little to make friends with kids whose families had money or property. She was sobbing so hard the judge had to call a recess when she admitted her mom made her become my friend, specifically because Granddad owned that house. The actual trial started 2 weeks later, and I was the first witness, and Victoria stared at me the whole time with this look like she wanted to kill me right there. When I talked about finding Granddad's papers in the basement, she actually smiled, which made the jury all turn to look at her. I wonder if Victoria kept smiling because she thought Harold's papers would never be enough evidence, but then how did all those other pharmacy workers find the courage to testify against someone so scary? Linda went up next with this old notebook from when her mom was in pharmacy school, and it had all these notes about experimenting with drug combinations that could hurt old people. She'd written stuff about thinning the herd and resource redistribution, like she was planning this her whole life. Day 3 of the trial brought 12 pharmacists who all told the same story about Victoria threatening them and making them change prescriptions. One guy had secretly recorded her saying if he didn't increase Mrs. Williams's dose, his daughter wouldn't get into any college in the state. The prosecutor saved the worst for last and played this video from Victoria's own security camera, showing her at her desk with Granddad's medical files spread out. She was talking to herself about 3 weeks at this level, then increased by 40% for heart failure by week 8, and she called it perfect. The jury only needed 3 hours to come back with guilty on everything, including 18 murders and 43 attempted murders and 127 counts of fraud. Victoria didn't even blink when they read it, but Bianca was crying so hard her sister had to hold her up. The judge called for order and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, but those 14 days dragged like months, with reporters camping outside my apartment and calling non-stop about interviews I kept refusing. On sentencing day, the courtroom was packed again with families holding photos of their dead relatives, and when the judge walked in, everyone went silent like we were all holding our breath together. He looked straight at Victoria and started reading from his papers about how she turned medicine into murder and betrayed the most sacred trust between pharmacist and patient, and then he said the words we'd all been waiting for, that she was getting life without parole plus 400 years consecutive for each victim. Victoria just smirked as they put her in shackles and led her away, while Bianca collapsed completely and had to be carried out by bailiffs. Outside the courthouse, 43 families surrounded me with their photos, and this woman Maria grabbed me in the tightest hug, saying my Granddad had saved her aunt who was on Victoria's list for the next month. 3 days later, Granddad's lawyer called saying there was something else, and when I got to his office, he handed me a key to a safety deposit box I never knew existed. Inside was a letter in Granddad's shaky handwriting that said if I was reading this then I'd done it and stopped them, and he was so proud of me, and to please live my life and not let the darkness define me, and it was signed Love Always. The Whitmore assets got frozen, then distributed to victims' families, with each getting between $500,000 and $2 million, depending on their losses, and when they asked what I wanted to do with Granddad's portion, I told them to use it for a free pharmacy for old people, which we named Harold's Haven. Linda asked to meet for coffee a week later, and she looked so different without all the designer clothes, just wearing jeans and a sweater, and she told me she was in therapy and planning to become a social worker to help protect the people her mother hurt. She pulled pulled out this old photo from her bag that showed Granddad teaching her class in elementary school, and she said he was the only adult who was ever kind to her when she was little, and she'd kept it hidden all these years. I went back to the hospice to thank the nurses, and the director showed me they'd created new rules called the Harold Protocol to protect patients from drug companies trying to exploit them, and they'd put a plaque on his old room that said, Harold's room, where love conquered greed. My phone buzzed with a message from Bianca saying she was moving to Oregon to start over, and would spend her life trying to make up for what her family did, and that my granddad was a hero, and so was I, and she was sorry she'd been too broken to see it, and she donated her whole trust fund to help old people. Mia helped me move into a small apartment near the law school I'd enrolled in, because watching those lawyers fight for justice had shown me what I wanted to do with my life, and we put Granddad's photo on the mantle where I could see it every day. Some nights I'd hear his voice in my head, but now it wasn't scary, just comforting, like he was still cheering me on, saying, that's my girl, keep fighting the good fight. 4 months after the trial, I went to Granddad's house, which was mine now, and started planting tomatoes in his garden with all the old neighbors helping and telling stories about how he'd fixed their roofs, or driven them to doctor appointments, or brought them groceries when they were sick. Mrs. Patterson mentioned she'd seen him going through pharmacy records 2 years ago, asking questions about certain medications, but he'd stopped when he got sick, and she realized he'd been trying to protect them even then. 6 months after everything ended, I stood at a podium in front of 300 people at a conference about elder abuse, telling them about a retired teacher who wouldn't stop fighting to protect his community, even when he was dying. After my speech, dozens of people came up with their own stories about suspicious deaths and strange medication changes, and I handed them my new business card from the Elder Justice Task Force, where I worked as an investigator now. The case had changed federal law, with pharmacies facing strict oversight and random audits and special protections for elderly patients, and the FBI estimated Granddad's investigation had saved over 200 lives from Victoria's expansion plans. I wear his watch every day and carry his notebook in my bag, and when I look at the tomatoes growing in his garden or see another elderly person get justice, I know he's still with me in the work we do together. Alright, that was a cool little journey. I had a blast just wondering about stuff and exploring it with you. Really fascinating conversation today. Can't wait to do it again. Like the video, it helps more than you think. Alright, that was a cool little journey. I had a blast just wondering about stuff and exploring it with you. Really fascinating conversation today. Can't wait to do it again. My sister threw a wine glass and had a screaming meltdown at Thanksgiving because I didn't tell her about my pregnancy before announcing it to the whole family. So I announced her biggest secret. Me and my husband Oliver found out I was pregnant in early October after trying for 2 years. We were so excited but also terrified because I'd had an early miscarriage the year before that devastated us. My doctor said everything looked good, but recommended waiting until after 12 weeks to tell people just to be safe. We decided Thanksgiving would be perfect since the whole family would be together, and we'd be at 14 weeks by then. I only told my brother Leo and my cousin Amy because they both knew about the miscarriage and kept checking on me. They promised not to tell anyone and actually kept their word. My sister Gina is 34 and has 4 kids and thinks that makes her the pregnancy expert of the family. She called me the week before Thanksgiving asking if I had any news to share. I said no, just looking forward to seeing everyone. She said I seemed different lately and wondered if something was going on. I changed the subject to her kids and she let it go, but I could tell she was suspicious. The thing about Gina is she literally cannot keep information to herself. When I got into my master's program, I told her first because I was so excited and wanted to share with my sister. She called our mom an hour later and announced it before I could. When Oliver proposed, I called her crying happy tears, and she immediately posted about it online, tagging our entire family before I could tell anyone myself. When I got promoted at work, she told everyone at Sunday dinner before I arrived. She always says she's just so excited for me she can't help herself, but it's really about her being the one with information to share. So this time Oliver and I agreed we wouldn't tell her until we told everyone. Thanksgiving came, and after dinner I stood up and said we had an announcement. I told everyone we were expecting and due in May. Everyone started cheering and hugging us except Gina, who just stared at me. Then she started crying. Not happy tears, but angry tears. She asked how long I'd known, and I said about 6 weeks. She lost it. She stood up and yelled that I was supposed to tell her first. She said she told me about all 4 of her pregnancies before anyone else, and I'd betrayed her by not doing the same. She said sisters were supposed to share everything, and I'd made her look stupid. My mom tried to calm her down, but Gina turned on her and asked if she knew. When my mom said no, Gina asked who did know. Amy and Leo stayed quiet, but Gina figured it out and started screaming at them too for keeping secrets. She said the whole family was against her and treating her like she couldn't be trusted. My dad told her to calm down and be happy for me, but she said how could she be happy when I'd deliberately excluded her from the most important news. She said I'd ruined our relationship and she'd never forgive me for making her the last to know. Then she went after Oliver, saying he'd turned me against my own sister. Oliver said we just wanted to wait until we were sure everything was okay. Gina said that was stupid because she would have supported me either way, and now she felt like I didn't consider her real family. She actually said the words, "Real family tells each other everything immediately." The irony was incredible coming from someone who spoiled every important moment I'd ever had. My brother Leo finally spoke up and said maybe if Gina could keep her mouth shut for once, people would tell her things. Gina threw her wine glass at the wall and it shattered everywhere. My 4-year-old nephew started crying. My mom started crying. Gina's husband Jake tried to get her to leave, but she refused. She said she wasn't going anywhere until I apologized for humiliating her. I said I wasn't apologizing for protecting my own announcement. She said I was a terrible sister and she was done with me. She told her kids to get their coats and started packing up the dishes she'd brought. While she was dramatically shoving Tupperware into bags, I stood up and said if we were sharing everything like real family, then everyone should know that Gina had been texting her ex-boyfriend Ryan for the past 6 months. Jake froze. Gina went white. The room went completely silent. Nobody moved. Jake's face changed from confused to hurt in about 2 seconds flat. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Gina's face was white as paper and her hands started shaking. She tried to speak but just made this weird choking sound. Jake grabbed his coat off the back of his chair and headed straight for the door. Gina finally found her voice and started saying it wasn't what I thought, that I didn't understand. But Jake was already out the door. She ran after him, and we all heard her yelling his name in the driveway. Her 4 kids just sat there at the table looking scared and confused. The youngest one, the 4-year-old who'd been crying about the glass, started wailing again. My mom jumped up and went over to comfort him, pulling him onto her lap and making those shushing sounds. The other 3 kids just stared at their plates. My dad sat frozen in his chair with this look on his face like someone had hit him with a brick. Amy got up and started picking up the bigger pieces of broken glass from the floor. Leo looked at me with wide eyes but didn't say anything. Oliver squeezed my hand under the table. I could hear Gina outside still yelling at Jake, begging him to wait, to let her explain. Then we heard a car door slam and an engine start. Gina's voice got louder, more desperate, but the car drove away. The sound of it faded down the street and then it was quiet except for the kids crying. Gina came back inside about 20 minutes later. Her mascara was running down her face in black streaks, and her eyes were all red and puffy. She stood in the doorway breathing hard like she'd been running. She looked around at all of us and then said Jake drove off and wouldn't answer her calls. She pulled out her phone and tried calling again right there in front of everyone. We could all hear it go straight to voicemail. She tried texting and her hands were shaking so bad she kept having to retype. Then she turned and looked right at me with this expression of pure hate. She screamed that I'd destroyed her marriage and ruined her children's lives just to get revenge over a stupid pregnancy announcement. She said I was evil and cruel and she'd never forgive me. My mom tried to calm her down, but Gina just kept screaming at me. She said I'd planned this whole thing, that I'd been waiting for the perfect moment to humiliate her in front of everyone. Oliver stood up and told her that wasn't true, that she'd started all of this by attacking me. Gina told him to shut up and said he'd turned me against my own family. The kids were all crying now, even the older ones. My nephew, who's 12, had his head down on the table with his arms over it. My dad finally spoke up. His voice was quiet but firm, and he said Gina needed to take responsibility for her own choices instead of blaming me for exposing them. He said she made the decision to text Ryan and she made the decision to lie to Jake about it. Gina turned on him and said he didn't understand, that nobody understood how hard her life was. She started crying harder and sank down into one of the dining room chairs. She put her face in her hands and her whole body shook. My mom went over and put a hand on her shoulder. Gina looked up at her and said she'd been so unhappy for years but didn't know how to fix it. She said being a mom to 4 kids were exhausting, and Jake worked all the time and she felt invisible in her own life. She said texting Ryan made her feel like herself again, like the person she used to be before marriage and kids took over everything. She said she never meant for it to go this far and she never physically cheated, but she knew it was wrong. She kept saying she was sorry over and over, but she was looking at my mom, not at me. My mom suggested Gina should take the kids home and that we all needed space to process what happened. Gina nodded and started gathering up her kids' coats and shoes. She packed up all the dishes she'd brought, shoving containers into bags with shaking hands. None of her kids would look at her. The 12-year-old grabbed his little brother's hand and led him toward the door. Gina didn't look at me even once while she was leaving. She just herded her kids out to her van and drove away. After they left, Amy got the broom and dustpan and swept up all the tiny pieces of glass. Leo and I cleared the table without talking. My mom was crying quietly at the kitchen sink. My dad just sat at the table staring at nothing. Oliver helped me carry dishes to the kitchen. The whole house felt heavy and sad, nothing like how Thanksgiving was supposed to be. Oliver and I left about an hour later after helping clean up. The drive home was quiet at first. Then about halfway there, I just started crying. I couldn't stop. All I could think about was how I'd wanted this to be a happy memory of announcing our baby, and instead it turned into this horrible disaster. Oliver reached over and held my hand while he drove. He said Gina's choices weren't my fault. He reminded me that she'd attacked me first, that she'd thrown a glass and had a complete meltdown over me not telling her about my pregnancy early. He said I had every right to defend myself after she came at me so hard. I knew he was right, but I still felt terrible. I kept seeing Jake's face when I said about Ryan and how it changed from confused to completely broken. I kept hearing Gina's kids crying. Oliver pulled into our driveway and turned off the car. He hugged me and let me cry on his shoulder. He said we were going to be okay, and the baby was going to be okay, and that was what mattered most. We went inside and I took a long shower and cried some more. Oliver made tea and we sat on the couch. He put on a movie, but neither of us really watched it. The next morning, I woke up and checked my phone. 17 missed calls from different family members. There were texts from my mom, my dad, Leo, Amy, and even some cousins I barely talked to. The longest text was from my mom asking me to explain how I knew about Ryan. I called her back right away. She answered on the first ring. I told her the whole story about how I saw the text on Gina's phone last month when she asked me to check a message while she was driving. I said I'd seen Ryan's name pop up with a bunch of heart emojis, and when I opened it, there were dozens of messages going back months. I said they were flirty and inappropriate, and I'd been carrying that knowledge around not knowing what to do with it. My mom sighed really loud. She said she wished I'd told her privately instead of announcing it like that in front of everyone. I said I wished Gina hadn't thrown a glass and screamed at me for protecting my pregnancy announcement. My mom went quiet for a minute. Then she said she understood I was defending myself, but that the way I did it caused a lot of damage. I asked if she'd talked to Gina, and she said Gina called her at 3 in the morning hysterical. She said Jake still wasn't answering Gina's calls and Gina didn't know where he went. My dad called me separately about an hour later. He said he supported me and thought Gina needed a wake-up call about her behavior. He said she'd been acting entitled for years and treating people badly without consequences. But he also said he was worried about Jake and the kids. He asked if I knew anything else about the Ryan situation beyond what I'd said at dinner. I told him I only saw a few flirty texts, but didn't know how deep it went. I said I didn't know if they'd met up or if it was just texting. My dad said Jake was probably trying to figure that out too. He said he hoped they could work it out for the kids' sake, but he wouldn't blame Jake if he couldn't get past it. We talked for a while about the whole mess. He said holidays were supposed to bring families together, but this one had blown everything apart. Before we hung up, he told me to take care of myself and the baby, and not let all this stress affect my pregnancy. 3 days went by with no word from Gina. I texted her once to ask if she was okay, but she didn't respond. Leo called and said he'd driven by her house and her van was there, but nobody answered the door. My mom was worried sick and kept calling Gina, but Gina only answered once to say she was fine and needed space. Jake finally responded to my dad's messages on the third day. He said he was staying at his brother Justin's place and needed time to think. My dad asked if he wanted to talk, but Jake said not yet. That same afternoon, Justin called my dad. Justin wanted to know what exactly happened at Thanksgiving because Jake wouldn't give him details. My dad explained the whole thing from start to finish. He told Justin about my pregnancy announcement and Gina's meltdown and the wine glass, and then me revealing about Ryan. Justin was quiet for a long time after my dad finished. Then he said Jake had shown up at his door Thursday night looking destroyed and had barely spoken since. He said Jake just sat on his couch staring at the TV without really watching it. Justin asked my dad if he knew how serious the thing with Ryan was. My dad said none of us knew for sure, but that Gina had admitted to texting him for months. Justin said this was going to get ugly, and he hoped everyone was ready for it. I spent the next few days basically hiding in our apartment. Oliver had to go back to work on Monday, so I was alone with my thoughts and my phone, which kept lighting up with messages. Most of them I ignored. Leo showed up on Tuesday evening with Chinese takeout and let himself in with the spare key we gave him. He set the bags on the counter and pulled out plates without asking if I was hungry. I appreciated that he didn't make a big deal out of it. He just started opening containers and dishing out fried rice like it was any normal Tuesday. We ate at the kitchen table and he told me Gina had been all over Facebook posting weird status updates. He showed me his phone and I read through them. One said something about how blood doesn't always mean loyalty. Another was about how some people will stab you in the back when you least expect it. The comments section under each post was full of relatives asking what was wrong and if she was okay. Leo scrolled further and showed me one where our aunt had commented, asking if this was about Thanksgiving. Gina had responded with a crying emoji and said some people in the family had shown their true colors. I felt sick reading it. She was making herself look like the victim when she was the one who threw a glass and screamed at me. Leo put his phone away and told me not to let it get to me. He said anyone with half a brain could see through Gina's drama. But I knew that wasn't true because not everyone had been there to see what actually happened. Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Amy. She said her mom had called her that morning asking about Thanksgiving. Apparently, someone had told Amy's mom a totally twisted version of events. According to what she heard, I had announced Gina's private business in front of everyone just to embarrass her because I was mad she didn't know about my pregnancy first. Amy said her mom actually asked if that was true. Amy told her the real story, but she wasn't sure her mom believed her completely. I texted back asking who told her mom that version, and Amy said she didn't know, but it had to be someone from Gina's side. I was so angry I wanted to throw my phone across the room. Gina was out there spinning the whole thing to make me look like some horrible person who went after her on purpose. She wasn't telling anyone that she had a complete meltdown at my pregnancy announcement, or that she threw a wine glass at the wall. She wasn't mentioning that she screamed at me and demanded an apology for protecting my own news. I texted Amy back and told her I couldn't believe Gina was doing this. Amy sent back a string of messages saying half the extended family probably thought I was the bad guy now. She said Gina had always been good at playing victim and making people feel sorry for her. I knew that was true, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. Thursday morning, my mom called. I almost didn't answer, but I knew she'd just keep calling until I picked up. She asked how I was feeling and if the baby was okay. I told her everything was fine physically. Then she got quiet for a second before saying she wanted to have a family meeting on Sunday. She said everyone needed to sit down and talk through what happened calmly, like adults. She specifically said Gina and Jake were invited if they would come. I felt my stomach drop. The last thing I wanted was more family drama. I told my mom I didn't think that was a good idea because I didn't need the stress right now. She said she understood, but that we couldn't just let this fester and tear the family apart. I said Gina was the one tearing things apart by lying about what happened. My mom sighed and said that was exactly why we needed to talk face to face. After I hung up, I told Oliver about it. He was loading the dishwasher and he stopped to look at me. He said maybe we should go so we could tell everyone our side of the story. I wasn't convinced, but he pointed out that if we didn't show up, Gina would control the whole narrative. He was right. I texted my mom back and said we'd be there. Sunday came way too fast. Oliver and I drove to my parents' house and my stomach was in knots the whole way. When we walked in, Leo was already there sitting on the couch. Amy showed up a few minutes later. My parents were in the kitchen making coffee and setting out cookies like this was some normal family gathering. Then Jake walked in alone. He looked terrible. His eyes were red and he had dark circles under them like he hadn't slept in days. My mom asked where Gina was and Jake pulled out his phone to show us a text. It said she refused to be in the same room as me and that she had nothing to say to any of us. My dad shook his head and muttered something under his breath. We all sat down in the living room and it was super awkward for a minute. Nobody knew how to start. Finally, Jake spoke up. He said he'd confronted Gina about Ryan the night of Thanksgiving after they got home. She'd admitted everything. Jake's voice cracked when he said they'd been texting every single day for 6 months. He said she'd also confessed to meeting up with Ryan for coffee twice. Once in September and once in early November. My mom put her hand over her mouth. Jake kept talking. He said Gina swore nothing physical happened between them. No kissing, no touching, just talking. But Jake said it didn't matter because she'd been having an emotional affair and lying to him about it for half a year. Leo asked if Jake believed her that nothing physical happened. Jake said he didn't know what to believe anymore. He said he'd checked her phone records and the text to Ryan went back even further than 6 months. More like 8 or 9 months. He'd also found emails between them that Gina had deleted, but that were still in her trash folder. Jake said reading those emails made him feel sick because Gina had been complaining about him to Ryan and telling Ryan she missed the way things used to be between them. My dad asked what Jake was going to do. Jake said he was thinking about separation. He said he couldn't stay in the house right now because every time he looked at Gina, he felt angry and betrayed. He was staying at his brother's place and only going home when Gina took the kids somewhere, so he could grab more clothes. Then Jake looked right at me and asked if anyone else in the family had known about Ryan before Thanksgiving. Everyone said no, except me. I admitted I'd known for about a month after seeing the texts on her phone. Jake nodded slowly like he was processing that. He didn't seem mad at me. He actually thanked me for telling him even though it came out the way it did. My mom spoke up then. She said maybe I could have handled it differently. Maybe I could have pulled Jake aside privately instead of announcing it in front of everyone. I felt my face get hot. I told her Gina was literally screaming at me and throwing things and demanding I apologize to her. I said I wasn't thinking about the best way to handle anything in that moment. I was defending myself after she ruined what was supposed to be a happy announcement about my baby. My dad jumped in and backed me up. He said Gina had created this whole situation with years of not respecting boundaries and with her own choices about Ryan. He said I shouldn't be blamed for finally standing up to her. My mom looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Leo changed the subject a little. He said this wasn't really about the pregnancy announcement anymore. He said Gina and Jake needed to figure out their marriage without dragging all of us through it. Jake agreed. He said he was going to tell Gina that if she wanted to save their relationship, they needed marriage counseling. He said he couldn't move forward without professional help because the trust was completely broken. After everyone left, I felt drained. Oliver drove us home and I stared out the window the whole way. That evening I got a Facebook message from someone I hadn't talked to in a while. Nora Hensley. She was a family friend who'd known my parents for years. Her message said she'd heard about what happened at Thanksgiving and wanted to reach out. She said she'd been through something similar with her own sister about 10 years ago. Her sister had boundary issues too and would share Nora's private information with everyone. Nora said it took her years to figure out how to set firm boundaries and stick to them. She offered to talk if I wanted advice. I messaged her back and we ended up talking on the phone for over an hour. She told me about specific things that had worked for her, like being really clear about what information was okay to share and what wasn't. She also said sometimes you have to accept that certain family members won't change and you have to protect yourself accordingly. Talking to Nora made me feel less alone. She got it in a way that people who haven't dealt with this kind of thing just don't. 2 weeks went by. Gina didn't contact me at all during that time. I heard updates through my mom and Leo. Gina and Jake were going to counseling. Jake had moved back home, but they were sleeping in separate rooms. Gina had blocked Ryan on everything and sent him some message saying she was wrong and needed to focus on her marriage. I didn't know if that was true or just what Gina was telling people. Then on a Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Gina. It said we needed to talk in person without everyone else around. My hands were shaking when I read it. I showed Oliver and he asked if I wanted him to come with me. I said yes immediately. I wasn't ready to face Gina alone. I texted her back and suggested meeting at a coffee shop near our apartment. She agreed. We set it for Saturday morning at 10. Saturday came and I barely slept the night before. Oliver and I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early. I ordered a decaf latte and we sat at a table in the back corner. Gina walked in right at 10 and she looked awful. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail and she had no makeup on. She had dark circles under her eyes that matched Jake's. She sat down across from us and immediately started crying. She said her whole life was falling apart. She said Jake barely looked at her anymore, and her kids kept asking why Daddy was sleeping in the guest room. She said she couldn't eat or sleep and she felt like she was losing her mind. Then she looked at me and said throwing the wine glass was wrong. She said there was no excuse for it and she was sorry. I didn't say anything. I just waited to see what else she would say. Gina kept crying and said she'd been jealous of me for years. She said everything seemed to come so easily to me. My education, my career, my marriage to Oliver. She said she felt stuck and unhappy and watching me succeed at everything made it worse. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Gina had always seemed so happy with her life. 4 kids, a nice house, a husband who worked hard. Meanwhile, I'd been struggling to get pregnant for 2 years and dealing with a miscarriage that broke my heart. I thought she had everything figured out while I was the one who couldn't get it right. But here she was telling me she felt trapped. She said being a mom was all she did anymore. She said she loved her kids, but sometimes she forgot who she was before them. She said watching me travel for work and go out with friends and have time for hobbies made her feel like she'd given up everything. She said she knew it was wrong to resent me, but she couldn't help it. She wiped her eyes with a napkin and said, texting Ryan made her remember when she was young and had her whole life ahead of her. She said it was stupid and she knew it wasn't real, but it felt good to have someone ask about her day and care about what she thought. Oliver reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. Gina looked at both of us and said she was sorry for throwing the glass. She said she was sorry for ruining my pregnancy announcement. She said she knew she had a problem with needing attention and being the first to know things. She said it made her feel important when she could share news before anyone else. She said her therapist was helping her understand why she did it. She said Jake told her he wanted counseling or he was leaving. She said she'd already had 3 sessions by herself and they were starting couples counseling next week. She said she was trying to change, but it was hard. I sat there for a minute just processing everything. Then I told her I forgave her for Thanksgiving. I said I understood she was going through stuff, but I needed her to respect my boundaries from now on. I said that meant not sharing my personal news without asking me first. I said it meant not making my moments about her. She nodded and said she would try. She asked if I would consider doing family therapy with her eventually. She said her therapist thought it might help us rebuild our relationship. I said maybe after we both had some time to work on ourselves separately. She seemed okay with that answer. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. Then Oliver and I got up to leave. Gina hugged me before we walked out and it felt different from usual. Less performative, more genuine. In the car, Oliver asked how I felt. I said I was cautiously hopeful but still hurt. I said I wanted to believe Gina was really changing, but I'd heard promises before. He said we'd take it one day at a time and see what happened. When we got home, I took a nap because the whole thing had drained me. A few days later, my dad called and said Jake had reached out to him. Jake told my dad that he and Gina were starting marriage counseling with someone named Aaron Simmons. My dad said Aaron specialized in dealing with affairs and trust problems. Jake had moved back into the house, but he was sleeping in the guest room. He told my dad he had conditions for staying. Gina had to be completely honest about everything with Ryan. She had to go to individual therapy. She had to respect boundaries with her phone and social media. My dad said Jake seemed serious about making it work, but also serious about his expectations. I was glad Jake wasn't just letting it slide. Gina needed to face real consequences. My next doctor appointment was 2 days after that conversation. Oliver came with me like he always did. The ultrasound tech measured everything and said the baby was growing perfectly. My doctor came in after and checked my blood pressure. She said everything looked great. She asked how my stress levels were, and I admitted the family drama had been rough. She said she could tell from my last appointment that I was tense. But she said this appointment showed the baby was doing fine despite everything. She reminded me that I needed to take care of myself and not let family stuff affect my health. She said the baby needed me to stay calm and healthy. I promised I would try. That weekend, my phone buzzed with a text from Gina. She sent me a photo of a piece of paper. It was homework from her therapist. The assignment was to write down every time she'd crossed someone's boundaries and think about making amends. I zoomed in on the photo. My pregnancy announcement was at the top of the list, but there were so many other things. She'd told my mom about Leo's girlfriend before he could. She'd posted about Amy's new job before Amy announced it. She'd shared my cousin's engagement news in the family group chat. She'd told people about my dad's health scare when he specifically asked her not to. The list went on and on, 12 different incidents just on the first page. Seeing it all written out made me realize this wasn't just about me. Gina had been doing this to everyone for years. I texted her back and said I appreciated her being honest about it. She sent back a heart emoji. My mom called me a week later sounding worried. She said Christmas was coming up in a few weeks. She asked if I thought we could all get together without more drama. I said I didn't know, but I was willing to try if everyone else was. She suggested doing something casual instead of a big formal dinner. Maybe just appetizers and games at her house. Nothing fancy. Lower pressure. I said that sounded better than trying to recreate a normal holiday. She said she'd talk to everyone else and see if they agreed. A few days later, she texted our family group chat with the plan. Everyone responded saying they were okay with it. The following Saturday, Leo and Amy came over to help us start setting up the nursery. Oliver had painted the walls the weekend before. Now we needed to put together furniture and organize baby clothes. Leo worked on assembling the crib while Amy helped me fold tiny outfits. She held up a onesie that said, "Mommy's Little Miracle," and made a joke about how at least my baby would have plenty of stories about family dysfunction to learn from. I laughed because it was true. This kid was going to grow up hearing about the Thanksgiving when Aunt Gina threw a wine glass. Oliver brought us pizza for lunch and we ate sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes. It felt good to focus on something positive instead of all the drama. By the end of the day, we had the crib built and the dresser assembled. The room was starting to look like an actual nursery. On Tuesday, I got a notification that I had mail. I went down to the mailbox and found a letter from Gina. No return address, but I recognized her handwriting. I opened it while walking back upstairs. It was 2 pages long. She started by saying her therapist helped her write it, but the words were all hers. She said she was sorry for every time she'd stolen my moments. She listed specific examples going back years. My graduation, my engagement, my promotion. She said she understood now that she did it because she felt invisible in her own life. She said making herself the messenger made her feel important and needed. She said it was selfish and wrong. She said she'd hurt me over and over and never really apologized before. She said she wasn't asking me to forgive her right away or trust her again immediately. She said she just wanted me to know she understood what she'd done and why it was wrong. She said she was committed to changing even if it was hard. There were no excuses in the letter. No, but I was just excited, or I didn't mean to hurt you. Just straight accountability. I read it twice and then showed it to Oliver. He said it seemed like real progress. I agreed, but part of me was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Christmas came faster than I expected. My mom called the week before asking if everyone was still okay with the casual gathering idea. I said yes and asked if Gina was planning to come. My mom said Gina confirmed she'd be there with her family and seemed excited about it. I felt nervous, but also curious to see if the changes were real or just temporary. Oliver reminded me that we didn't have to stay long if things got uncomfortable. We could always leave early if Gina started acting like her old self. The morning of Christmas Eve, my dad texted me saying he'd talked to Jake the night before. Jake told him the marriage counseling was actually helping them communicate better for the first time in years. He said Gina had been completely open with her phone and told him everywhere she went. She blocked Ryan on all her social media and messaging apps. She even wrote Ryan a message before blocking him saying she was wrong to talk to him and needed to focus on fixing her marriage. My dad said Jake seemed cautiously hopeful that they could work things out. I texted back asking if he thought Gina would actually keep it up, or if this was just temporary. My dad said only time would tell, but he'd never seen her take responsibility like this before. We arrived at my parents' house around noon, and Leo was already there helping set up appetizers. Amy showed up right after us with a cheese board she'd made. The house felt relaxed instead of tense like Thanksgiving had been. My mom had put out board games and card games on the coffee table. She made it clear this wasn't about a fancy meal or perfect decorations. Gina arrived with Jake and the kids around 1. I watched her walk in carrying a wrapped present and a casserole dish. She spotted me across the room and gave me a small wave. Not the dramatic hug she usually forced on people, just a simple wave. She set her stuff down and came over to where Oliver and I were standing near the fireplace. She asked how I was feeling and if the pregnancy was going well. I said everything was good and the baby was healthy. She smiled and said she was really happy for us. Then she actually walked away to go help my mom in the kitchen instead of standing there dominating the conversation. I looked at Oliver and he raised his eyebrows like he was thinking the same thing I was. This was different. Throughout the afternoon, Gina kept surprising me. When Leo started telling a story about something funny that happened at his job, she listened instead of interrupting with her own story. When Amy mentioned she was thinking about getting a dog, Gina asked questions instead of immediately giving advice. When my dad brought up my pregnancy and asked how I was handling the symptoms, Gina let me answer without jumping in with her 4 pregnancies worth of expertise. She was present but not overwhelming. She participated without taking over. We played a few rounds of cards and Gina laughed at jokes and seemed genuinely relaxed. Her kids were running around playing with toys and she wasn't constantly hovering or making everything about being a perfect mom. Jake looked more at ease than I'd seen him in months. He actually smiled when Gina made a joke about her terrible card hand. Before we ate dinner, Gina pulled a wrapped box out of her bag and handed it to me. She said it was for the baby and she hoped I liked it. I opened it and found a handmade baby blanket with little stars and moons sewn into the fabric. It was beautiful, and clearly took a lot of time to make. I thanked her, and she said she'd been working on it for the past few weeks in her free time. She didn't make a big announcement about it or try to get everyone's attention. She just gave it to me quietly and seemed genuinely happy when I said it was perfect. After dinner, my mom pulled me into the kitchen while everyone else was cleaning up. She hugged me and said thank you for giving Gina another chance. She said she could see real changes in her daughter, and it meant everything to have both her girls getting along again. I told my mom I was still being careful, but I had to admit Gina seemed different today. My mom said she'd been praying for this, and watching Gina actually work on herself gave her hope. I said I was hopeful too, but I needed to see if Gina could keep this up long term. My mom understood and said that was fair. We went back out to the living room and spent the rest of the evening playing games and talking. Gina stayed until around 8 and then said her kids needed to get home for bed. She hugged everyone goodbye, including me. It was a normal hug. Not too long or too tight. Just a regular sister hug. She told me to text her if I needed anything and then left with her family. After they were gone, Leo came over and asked what I thought. I said I didn't know what to think because it was so different from how Gina usually acted. He said maybe the whole Thanksgiving disaster actually shocked her into changing. Amy joined us and said she was impressed because Gina didn't try to make a single thing about herself all day. Oliver said it was definitely progress, but we should stay cautious. I agreed. One good day didn't erase years of boundary stomping, but it was a start. The first week of January, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Gina. She said she was calling from her therapist's office because Aaron wanted to know if I'd be willing to come to one of their sessions. He thought it would help if we could talk through our relationship issues with a professional there to guide the conversation. My stomach dropped because the idea of sitting in therapy with Gina sounded terrible. But then I thought about my baby and how I wanted them to have a relationship with their aunt and cousins. I asked Gina if this was something she actually wanted, or if Aaron was making her do it. She said she wanted to try because she missed having me as her sister. I told her I needed to think about it and talk to Oliver. She said that was fine and to let her know. I hung up and immediately called Oliver at work. He said it was my decision, but he thought it might be good to have a neutral person there to make sure the conversation stayed productive. I talked to Amy that night and she said the same thing. Leo said he'd support whatever I decided. I spent 2 days thinking about it before texting Gina that I'd come to one session. She sent back a thank you message and said Aaron's office would call me to schedule. 3 days later, I walked into a small office building and found the right suite number. Gina was already sitting in the waiting room looking nervous. She gave me a weak smile and I sat down across from her. Neither of us said anything while we waited. A door opened and a man in his 40s with glasses came out. He introduced himself as Aaron and shook my hand. He led us both into his office and we sat on opposite ends of a couch. Aaron sat in a chair facing us and thanked me for coming. He said the goal today was just to start opening up communication, and he'd help make sure we both felt heard. He asked me to start by explaining how Gina's behavior over the years had affected me. I took a breath and said it made me feel like I couldn't trust her with anything important in my life. Every time something good happened to me, she had to be the one to tell everyone else first. It made my accomplishments feel like they belonged to her instead of me. I said the pregnancy announcement was the final straw because I'd already lost one baby and needed to protect this one. Aaron nodded and asked Gina if she understood what I was saying. Gina's eyes were filling with tears, but she said yes. She said she never thought about how her actions made me feel because she was too focused on how being the messenger made her feel important. Aaron asked her to explain that more. Gina said she felt invisible in her own life most of the time. She had 4 kids and a husband, but felt like she'd lost herself completely. When she got to share other people's news, it made her feel relevant and needed. She said it was selfish and wrong, and she understood that now. I felt myself getting emotional hearing her admit this stuff out loud. Aaron asked me how it felt to hear Gina's explanation. I said it helped me understand why she did it, but it didn't erase the hurt. Gina nodded and said she wasn't asking me to forget everything. She just wanted a chance to be better. Aaron said that was a good place to start and asked if we were both willing to work on rebuilding trust. We both said yes. I spent the next few weeks going to therapy with Aaron and having coffee dates with Gina, where we practiced talking without falling into old patterns. She was trying hard to listen, instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. Oliver said he could see the difference in how she acted around me. My belly was getting bigger every day, and I felt the baby moving more and more. Gina texted me one morning asking if she could stop by that afternoon. I said yes, and she showed up at 2 with a bunch of containers. She brought freezer meals she spent all morning making. Casseroles and soups and pasta dishes all labeled with cooking instructions. She said she wanted to help after the baby came and figured having ready-made dinners would be useful. I was surprised and touched because she didn't have to do that. She asked what else I might need, and I told her I wasn't sure yet since this was all new to me. She said to let her know anytime and that she didn't expect to be in the delivery room or anything. She just wanted to be helpful however I was comfortable with. I thanked her and she left after about 30 minutes. Oliver came home from work and saw all the food in the freezer. He said Gina was really making an effort, and it showed. 2 weeks later on a Tuesday night, I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I felt a weird cramping sensation. I stood up and felt water running down my legs. My water broke right there in the living room. I called for Oliver, who came running from the bedroom. He grabbed the hospital bag we packed weeks ago and helped me to the car. The contractions started getting stronger on the drive, and I was breathing through them like we learned in the birthing class. Oliver called my parents from the car and told them we were heading to the hospital. My mom answered and asked if we wanted her to tell Gina. I said yes, because even though we weren't as close as we used to be, she was still my sister, and I wanted her to know. Oliver dropped me at the emergency entrance and went to the park while a nurse got me in a wheelchair. They took me up to labor and delivery and got me into a room. The doctor checked me and said I was already 4 centimeters. The contractions kept getting worse, and I asked for the epidural. The anesthesiologist came and put in the needle, and after about 20 minutes, the pain got better. Oliver sat next to me holding my hand while we waited. My parents showed up around 10 and sat with us for a while. My mom kept telling me I was doing great, and my dad looked nervous. Labor went on for hours and hours. I was exhausted and just wanted it to be over. The doctor kept checking my progress, and finally around 8 the next morning, she said I was ready to push. Oliver stood next to me, coaching me through each push. After what felt like forever, I heard crying, and the doctor said it was a girl. They put her on my chest, and she was perfect. Tiny and pink with a full head of dark hair. Oliver was crying, and I was crying, and we couldn't believe she was finally here. The nurses cleaned her up and weighed her. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. They handed her back to me wrapped in a blanket, and I just stared at her face. My parents came in first to meet their granddaughter. My mom cried and held her while my dad took about 100 pictures. They stayed for an hour before leaving to let us rest. Leo and Amy came next, bringing flowers and a stuffed giraffe. Amy held the baby and said she was beautiful. Leo looked scared to hold her, but finally did, and smiled the whole time. They left after about 30 minutes. Gina showed up last with Jake carrying a big gift bag. She walked over to my bed and asked if she could hold her niece. I said yes and passed the baby to her. Gina's face just melted looking down at her. Tears started running down her cheeks, and she whispered that she was so beautiful. She told me I was going to be an amazing mom. She only stayed 20 minutes before handing the baby back and saying we should rest. She and Jake left, and I felt good about how she handled it. She respected the boundaries without me having to remind her. The first few weeks at home were harder than I expected. The baby cried all the time, and I barely slept. Oliver helped as much as he could, but he had to go back to work after 2 weeks. Gina texted every few days asking how things were going. She offered specific things like picking up groceries or coming over to watch the baby so I could nap. She didn't just show up like she used to. She waited for me to say yes before coming over. One afternoon, I was so tired I couldn't think straight, so I texted her asking if she could come hold the baby for an hour. She was there in 15 minutes. I went upstairs and slept while she rocked the baby downstairs. I woke up feeling so much better. She had also done my dishes and folded the laundry. I thanked her, and she said that's what sisters do. It felt different from before. She was helping because I asked, not because she wanted credit for it. At the 2-month checkup, the pediatrician said the baby was healthy and gaining weight perfectly. She said I was doing a great job as a first-time mom. Oliver and I were starting to figure out a routine. We knew her different cries and when she needed to eat or sleep. Having family around to help made everything easier. My mom came over once a week to give me a break. Leo brought dinner sometimes. Gina checked in regularly but never pushed to come over if I said I was busy. The whole family was being respectful and supportive in ways they hadn't been before. Gina and I met for coffee when the baby was 10 weeks old. We sat outside at a cafe near my house. She told me therapy was helping her understand herself better. She said she realized her whole identity got wrapped up in being a wife and mom, and she forgot who she was. She started taking art classes at the community center on Saturday mornings. She joined a book club that met twice a month. She was finding things that made her happy outside of her family. She seemed lighter somehow, less desperate for attention and validation. I was proud of her for doing the work. My dad mentioned to Oliver one night that Jake told him their marriage was better than it had been in years. Jake said he and Gina were actually talking honestly for the first time. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. The whole crisis with Ryan forced them to deal with problems they'd been ignoring. Jake said he was grateful they got the chance to rebuild instead of just letting things fall apart. Gina was being completely open with her phone and her schedule. She was putting in effort to make Jake feel secure again. It was working. On the baby's 3-month birthday, we had everyone over for dinner. Nothing fancy, just pizza and salad. My parents came, and Leo and Amy and Gina's whole family. The kids played in the backyard while the adults sat around talking. Gina helped set the